We're very fortunate to have James Carpenter and Joseph Welker of James Carpenter Design Associates present their work and ideas. The work of JCDA combines the practices of architecture, art, and material research into designing places that enhance how the passage of diurnal and seasonal time is experienced. This type of design requires conceptualizing how time unfolds in space and is parallel to the gardens of landscaper Pate Udolph, the minimalist work of artist James Turrell, and the buildings of architect Stephen Hull. Jamie has taken a cross-disciplinary approach from the beginning, first studying architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design, then glassmaking, and finally graduating with a degree in sculpture. His explorations in all these areas has expanded since then. Joe first worked with Jamie on the design of the Time Warner Center public glass facade fronting Columbus Circle in the late 90s. He is the current studio director at JCDA. Jamie and Joe, welcome.
Great, thank you very much, David. And Corinne, thank you very much. And we're very happy to have an opportunity to speak to all of you this evening. And this opportunity came about actually through HLB Lighting and a project we're working on together down in San Diego. But just to bring you up to date in terms of how our practice really began and how it is actually sort of structured relative to addressing these different project opportunities. As David just mentioned, I was a student at Rhode Island School of Design, went to school there originally in architecture and then moved into the sculpture program, primarily because I was interested in light and interested in glass in particular, and spent quite a few years working with glass. And then ultimately the work I was doing was in film, and worked with Corning Glass on technical glass projects through the 70s, and then eventually late 70s sort of started our firm in New York, sort of bringing to architects an understanding of glass, a little deeper understanding of the glass and light, control of light, and then began getting opportunities to work with IMPA and Foster and some other firms very early on. But just to start off, just to show you a little bit of how we think about projects conceptually, if we start with this first project, which was done back in the sort of early to mid 70s, and it's really a film installation. And I think that a lot of the work I did in the early 70s had to do with finding events in nature, sort of where you see different phenomena in nature, then recording them in a way that you slightly change the timing, and then they become an installation. So in this instance, this is a small river in Puget Sound that run by the University of Washington for introducing different strains of salmon. And what we did is we set up a series of cameras over the river, looking straight down into the surface of the river. And you basically have a fragment of the entire riverbed with the movement of the salmon during their migratory journey going up through it. And what we're trying to capture here is really, there's obviously this event taking place within the river itself, but if you imagine the thickness of that water, there's sort of a reflective field of information on the surface of the water in terms of the reflections, caustic reflections, and movement of the water. Then there's information within the water, which is obviously the fish and other activation of the water itself. And then you're seeing the beyond the water to the bottom of the river. And this whole idea of this transparent material having multiple layers of information, I think is really what we try to work on. And then this film, particularly in the installation, is about the longer you look at the film, the more you realize you're looking at this perfect reflection of the sky overhead. So there's always this level of information in front of us, and we tend to not acknowledge it or recognize it, so that many of our projects are trying to pull out of our context, or wherever the public space may be, events that are there but are under acknowledged. So anyway, these films, this particular film, as I said, sort of mid 70s, and then if we look at the next project, which is about 10 years later, it was a commission for a small project, a bridge actually for a family in California. And it's essentially a glass bridge. It's about 100 feet long, and you access the bridge on these two gangways. So your movement of crossing the water is really along the glass platform, where you're moving in the direction of the river or against the direction of the river. So the walking surface, sort of a translucent glass, basically captures that reflected image of the surface of the water underneath it. So it's carrying caustic reflections. And then the panels that move down the bridge are all slightly reflective. So they are basically superimposing different landscape surrounding your passage. And the whole idea here is you're creating a moment in time where you can more deeply understand a particular ecology. And you have a sense of participating in this movement of the river itself alongside with your own movement to get from one side of the river to the other. So these types of projects, even though they're done quite a long time ago, still are sort of the root of many of the projects we do. And this is in Chicago, a project for the University of Chicago and for the city of Chicago. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side is really a plan for where the World's Fair would take place in 1893. And the park, the linear park you see there is what's in front of you on the right, done by Olmsted. And the hope was to connect the lake, basically at the north here, to this inland park, and you would actually have boats and different things happening there. But eventually this was just an ordinary sort of depression, sort of a turf depression. And it's a very dark sort of park connecting University of Chicago on the left there with the South Side community on the right. So our task here was how to cross this park and make these parkways, the new axes across the park, much more vibrant, sort of safe, very, very self-directive in the sense of wayfinding. So we developed this whole idea of how to do these lighting towers, which you see in the next image, working with a company in Minneapolis that actually do filtration systems. But we worked with them on making these towers out of these continuously wrapped stainless steel wires around cores. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing the light source, which is basically just a quartz light source with what was called totally internal reflectance film. So it's really one source of light that goes up to the top of the mast and reflects back down to the mast. So none of the light actually escapes it. And in this image, we're sort of testing the different densities of the cladding around that tower. And you can see this on the next image. By controlling the density and shape of that wire that you see being wrapped, you create these actual columns of light. They're actually vary. There's greater intensity down low, and again, a little more intensity at the top. But they are very different than conventional light fixtures as you see this transitions in the nighttime, in that they are emanating the light horizontally. So the figures are completely illuminated. You're sort of washing the entire figure as you approach these with the light source, as opposed to conventional lights, which are all coming from overhead. So working with Schuller Shook, who was a Chicago lighting firm that we've done quite a bit of work with, removed as many of the street lights as possible based on the illumination that we were providing. And then we created the center of these roadways as basically gathering spaces. So right in the middle, there's a bit of landscape, there's some seating. So instead of just rushing from one side of the park to the other, summer and winter, you actually have a place to gather and then overview these public spaces where the sort of intramural sports take place, or a skating rink as well in the winter. So this company is one that we've worked with quite often on projects, and that bridge that we just showed you basically is a threshold between these two communities in Hyde Park and the South Side. And this is a threshold and done in a very, very different way, which is for the Sydney Olympics back in 2000. And this Olympics was really about reclaiming basically post-industrial landscapes, toxic landscapes, reviving them and sort of capping some of the soil contamination and returning them to sort of public leisure use. And we were asked to sort of design the entryway to the park. And in this instance, you can see all the parking, athlete housing is sort of on the left, and you would move across this bridge into the Olympic Park itself with the stadium on the right. And we took this small mangrove stream that you see below the bridge and then created this alignment of 5 masts over the bridge. And you'll see this in a moment. The whole idea here is to basically create a synthetic cloud. So these masts are, as you see in the sort of technical drawing, the masts are about 100 feet high, and the top 10 to 12 feet of each mast is a misting system. So we're taking water from out of the river, filtering it and pumping it up under high pressure. So each mast is sort of creating a field of mist, and they sort of blend together to sort of create this cloud floating overhead when you're walking across this pedestrian bridge. And then most critically, as you see on the right-hand side in that diagram, is a mirror system, which is a heliostat. And this is a mock-up that we're just doing to experiment with this. And the whole idea here is, how do you see something light, basically, floating in space overhead in the middle of the day under direct sun? So you're trying to counteract the intensity of the direct sun, in this case by using a filtration glass, actually a dichroic. So it's bouncing all the yellow light back, to which your eye is very attuned and very alert to, and allowing all the blue light to pass through the glass. So your eye actually picks up this whole beam of light. And if it were not a filtration glass, you would hardly see this beam, which is of interest. The eye wouldn't necessarily pick it up. It's just when you all of a sudden shift the color wavelength of the light, the eye becomes more aware of it. So this little mock-up led to the next image, begins to show you the construction of it, the mast being built down in the riverbed itself, the construction down there. And then in the distance, you see the tall mast, which is shown again on the right-hand side here, the men just getting the heliostat aligned. And the heliostat, if you're not aware, is basically a mirror system that tracks the sun all day long. Regardless of where the sun is in the sky, you can control a constant beam of light, which in this instance actually moves past and through the alignment of all the masts. So the masts are all in a north-south alignment, and a beam of sunlight is passing across the tops of each of those masts all times of the day. So the next image. So what happens when you walk into the park during the daytime is you walk through or underneath this sort of cloud that's being formed overhead, and then you see this beam of light. Actually, of course, with light, you don't see light unless it hits a target. So the mist is our target in this instance. And you're seeing it almost looks like it's on fire in certain instances, but under different weather conditions, it can be fragmentary like this. On a very windy day, it can be slightly more fragmentary, but on a very high humid day, you can get a solid beam of light that's literally almost a kilometer long coming off this one mirror. So anyway, it's a way of sort of, for the theme of the Olympic Park, this whole idea of renewal of landscape also deals with renewal of water resources. So this is basically a work that draws your attention to the natural evaporation of water from the Earth's surface, its condensation in the air overhead, and again, its descent to the Earth by rain or mist. So it's really just trying to take a process that's happening around us, but we don't normally pay attention to it, and allow it to become this signatory element that's sort of celebrating this entry into the park. So that's Sydney. I think that's the last image of that. Is that advancing, Joe, or it's sort of stuck on that?
A little bit stuck. You see it now. So kind of building upon the threshold that Jamie was describing, this is a project at Duke University, North Carolina, which was seeking to really expand and weave together some different parts that were very separate that occupied a lot of student use, specifically the student center here on the left, an auditorium, and then a bridge and a kind of student gathering space on the right. So this gives you an aerial view of what we were seeking to accomplish in terms of really knitting together what was it's a traditional part of the campus, but ended up having a lot of backdoor uses in this originally. There's some trash use and some things that you wouldn't want to be part of your quad experience necessarily. So it was really an effort to weave together the better parts of the campus, specifically the Sky Dome in an outdoor environment, create a protected place where students not only could move across that threshold and but also gather. So this is a kind of detail study that shows what we were seeking to do is to create a kind of protected environment below that threshold, the bridge, and really create and establish a space that also enhances the kind of natural environment of the quad around it and the sunlight coming from above. So this top image here shows that just by some simple moves, like creating a reflective surface on the underside of a bridge, which is concrete, you can get some amplified and redirected views to a landscape that's immediately adjacent and filtered light that kind of weaves through a tree canopy. On the bottom image, it was trying to work with a series of lenses that were actually placed within the bridge itself. So it gives you a real-time animation of what's happening above with people circulating, but a real sense of bright light and kind of uplifting experience that kind of connects you to the larger campus. So these are some more details in terms of the material investigation. The image here on the left is a acid etched diffusion on the glass it allows you to get a sense of activity and animation within the space without giving you direct visibility. So you have some sense of connection while still feeling somewhat in a protected environment. The images on the bottom here show a glass production that we explored and a group that we like to work with. We work with a number of fabricators, as Jamie was describing the group in Minneapolis. This particular glass company is in Oakland, California. And so you can develop a very specific mold and very specific casting that's tailored to the use and what you want to achieve in terms of light and optics. So in this particular case, this bigger lens that you're seeing here was the bottom portion of what becomes a kind of natural fixture. It's like a reinterpretation of the Sky Dome up above. So you start to see it in its actual application where you have students in gathering spaces down below, and then you have these lenses that really seek to kind of capture as much brightness as possible in the spaces of the sky up above and redirect it onto that polished concrete. We thought the columns as part of that, we really wanted to celebrate the structure of the bridge. And the columns could amplify a kind of sense of trees and connectivity to a natural environment, both beyond here, but also behind you, kind of help to like really establish an environment that when you're in it, you have a real sense, a kind of magnification of the landscape that you're around, but you still feel you're in a separate kind of contained environment here. So this gives you another view of an image down below the bridge and the acid etched glass and kind of a figure moving beyond as they navigate between the two elevations. In some ways, a different type of threshold in New York City. This is the Hearst Tower by Norman Foster, where they had a historic podium. And then the tower that you may be somewhat familiar with or completely familiar with up above, it's an office tower. There's a series of skylights here that ring the historic structure along the street and the tower volume up above. So our task was really to look at ways to kind of ease the transition of people coming in off the street. So you're kind of in a light and filled environment, New York City street, very noisy and congested, depending on the time that you're there. And you move into an environment here where you see a transition and a real sense of both light and also sound. And Jamie started to talk about the water qualities that were in the project in Sydney. In this case, we were really seeking to amplify and immerse participants with the sound of water cascading down. So you move into a very serene environment as you kind of ascend up into an elevator bank and go up into the tower itself. Conceptually, that's what we were trying to do, I think, both the sound and the light in terms of redirecting. But the other important concept here was that the water is recycled. So the water is gathered on these rooftops, it's chilled, and then it runs down the surface of the glass here, a little bit over 20 feet. And then it provides a degree of evaporative cooling and really creates a kind of environment that's both more calming from an acoustic standpoint, but also thermally comfortable. So we frequently try to mix some performative aspects with what we're achieving or working to achieve in a visual. This is a very specific photo of liquid glass being poured into a mold. So this kind of shows you the process in which these castings were developed. There's a series of end stops here, and the glass comes through a funnel up above and is poured and filled out into the mold. And then this goes into an annealing oven where the cooling process is slowed down, try to ensure that the thickness of the glass doesn't create fractures, and you get basically equalize all the forces within the glass itself. But you can also see in this image, you're starting to see some of the textures that we can develop within these molds. So by really detailing the mold and working with profiles that both amplify the light and the presence of light within the space, you can also play around with and investigate ways to slow the water as it moves over the surface. So you kind of choreograph it in a way that the water and the light start to move together as you move into this space. This shows you installation pictures, gives you an idea of the scale. Two people would lift up one of these planks that you were seeing in that mold I was trying to describe, and then installed in a series of brackets that cascade down. You see the overall, you start to get a sense of the overall space here as you come into the lobby environment of the tower. And then this gives you an overall picture of, you come in, this is immediately upon entry through the vestibule. So you come through a cue card or a gated area for security, and then everybody ascends up or down these sets of elevators that take you up into this elevated clear story space. So you can see all the daylight pouring through above. And most critical for us was really seeing this as a periscope device in many ways that really amplified your sense of sky up above. Even though you have this office tower directly above you, you have a real sense that there's a connection to the sky and the spaces beyond the immediate entry. We developed a block too that was a kind of element that adds a little bit of intrigue and interest in terms of light cascading through the fountain. So you can kind of see that. This is a picture from the clear story space, which is a cafeteria for the employees within the office building. Looking down, and you can see the raking light, it kind of catches and amplifies your sense of depth and your connection to the sky up above. Which leads to this next project. I think Jamie was going to talk to some of the ideas here.
This is obviously right down near the World Trade Center site, and we worked on that tower that you see there, World Trade Center Tower 7, earlier, which was the first building built downtown after 9/11. And on the right-hand side along Broadway, you see that smaller square building, like a pavilion, and then that circular element in the center, which is what we focused on. This is a project with Arab and Grimshaw. And in this instance, we're sort of commissioned by the Metropolitan Transit Authority directly to deal with sort of bringing daylight and sort of create an activation to this large public environment. And the project here is really all underground. I mean, it's connecting many of the subway lines in New York that run north-south by east-west tunnels. So this is a new transit center in the sense that Grand Central is a transit center up further uptown. Downtown never really had this type of interchange before. So the point of this building was to establish better circulation between the different subway lines. And this is basically our drawing from the original competition entry. Main focus is on this central oculus piece, but we were also trying to encourage using daylight devices in all of the entries up at street level so that there'd be a natural daylighting opportunity to be used as wayfinding throughout the whole system. But going from this project started in 2004 and was completed, I think, about 2012, something like that, or even later maybe. But we had a different form to begin with, and then through the process of design, of necessity, we had to sort of change the whole roof scape, and it sort of pushed us in a direction which was actually better from our perspective in terms of being able to animate the surface. But upper right hand, you know, is a very early radiant study of light entering this shape. But you notice the shape is actually sort of a slightly asymmetrical toroidal shape. Like you have the aperture, which is the skylight above. And typically when you have a skylight, obviously your view of the sky is framed very precisely by the boundary of that skylight itself. In this instance, we have the skylight overhead, but we also have these two curved surfaces extending down into the building. So if you look at the blue cone looking upwards, that's your view prescribed by the diameter of the skylight overhead. And then the angled lines of sight are if you looked obliquely, or if you're off center in the space looking at this curved surface, you're actually looking at a much bigger sky plane than you typically have with a conventional skylight. So this whole idea of changing the geometry of the area surrounding the aperture, you can bring in much, much more light. And obviously in this instance, bring in a much broader sense of the view of the sky overhead. And the whole goal here was to bring light down below ground, down to the subway track levels, and have this place be very celebratory. We're working with Arabs. There are a lot of issues behind this form, which is all the smoke evacuation systems for the subway itself. So the whole idea is that the form is what they call a smoke reservoir. If you had a big fire in the subway system, smoke would rise up into this cone-shaped form, and then the smoke goes right through the skin to the exhaust fans behind it. So to Joe's point, a lot of our work has built into it. It's not really overt, but it has a more performative aspect to it, as well as sort of visual, sort of optical effects. So anyway, the porosity is all changing along that whole form, which is about 90 feet high. And you see how it's constructed. It's all, it's a two-way cable net structure. The advantages of this is that it's all built off-site. It's predetermined in terms of its geometry. And the men basically just have to secure it at the top of the form to a compression ring, and then down at the bottom, first floor slab, and then tension it, and then apply these panels, which are made out of a optical aluminum, which we use in quite a few of our projects. And optical aluminum is simply a very thin, almost pure aluminum that's been pressed under high compression with a very fine texture. And then that thin aluminum is mounted to a conventional aluminum behind it. So you have a much higher degree of reflection here, up to like 94, 95% reflectivity off of this aluminum, but it's actually a diffuse reflection. It's not a mirror reflection. And this is actually probably one of the most important aspects of all of our work. We don't typically work with a mirror or reflective materials per se. They're always slightly below a reflection, so that it does something we call that actually holds the light. The light can actually reside on the surface, and it's not necessarily just bouncing light, because the problem obviously with a mirror is that you either have a reflection of all of the light, like 100% brightness reflected towards you, or if the light source is positioned elsewhere, it's totally black. So either have absence or presence of light with a conventional mirror. With this type of a mirror reflective surface, the light is actually distributed much more uniformly across its surface, and it always possesses some level of brightness to it. So this material is critical in this instance. So as you see the next image, what you're looking at here, I just described you in the earlier diagram, this shape. It's sort of hard to tell what that shape is if you don't see a cross section of it. It's a fairly extended form. And what you're looking at here is in the building. Like if you look at that white area at the center of this ring, that's actually a cloud in the sky back over your head. So it's actually, you're looking at sky plane behind you in this instance and seeing clouds around the perimeter here moving. So you can actually sit in this space at certain times of day early morning, later afternoon, not when the sun's directly overhead, where it's too much light, but in these other times of day, you can actually see the shift in the color of the sky, and you can actually see the movement of clouds brought into the building. So it's again, it's a little bit of a fragment of cinematic behavior, which is something we do try to work with. I hope that's sort of been consistent in what we've been showing you. There's this whole idea that there's a degree of animation to the work, and your perception of it or celebration of it as an individual is totally unique. Like somebody standing 6 feet away from you is seeing something quite different. And it's this whole idea that everybody in this space is seeing something slightly different, but you're all collectively sort of understanding that there's this idea of the image of the sky being folded down into the space with you. So it's just a fairly simple optical principle, but one that we don't think has really been deployed successfully very often. And then this was a perfect instance to try to make that work. So here you have a scale of the space in this piece overhead. And I think this is one of the points that you're asking us to speak about a little bit, is this whole idea of animation of public spaces and how you create this sort of dynamic. Well, this is sort of the perfect example of how that's done by fairly analog methodology, right? This is just simple optics, just like Hearst. It's very simple prismatic optics that allow the sunlight to bounce through those heavy glass castings or prisms and then bounce to your light. But it's just done at a different scale that you're not familiar with. So anyway, this has been a very successful project, and also one near us, so we've had a chance to view it over time. And Joe will speak about this project also, a different type of threshold.
Yeah, and a different connection to the sky too. This is the arch. You can see in St. Louis, so you can see the shadow here cast on the Mississippi River, and you can also get a sense. This is the excavation that was going on. This was the existing museum, which was the second largest museum in the national park system after Ellis Island. So it was a massive. Well, it's a large museum that didn't have a real connection to the city. I think so. When we got involved in this project through a competition in 2010, we teamed with Michael Van Valkenburg and other team members in a successful competition bid. I think one of the critical things was really connecting and reinvigorating this urban park, which is a bit unusual, but we're not so unfamiliar with it in New York. There's a couple of urban parks that are part of the national park system, connecting it with the city and really enhancing both. So you have a new landscape that really could weave itself in to the courthouse, this is the old courthouse where the Dred Scott case originated. So a very significant historical part of the National Park Service, and really weave these two together. And obviously the destination piece, if any of you have done this, to go up to the arch. This is, I think, still the tallest office building, or not tallest office building, but tallest building in St. Louis. It's about 630 feet above the ground plane here, and you can see the river over here. So what we were really trying to do was to create these centered recentering. One of the magical things about the arch is it's a monument that isn't an object, it's really a space. So it really lends itself to weaving through the landscape. This is a view from that landscape on the city side, looking across what existed before we started construction. When we won the competition in 2010, many lanes of traffic and a submerged highway. So this was quite noisy. It was an interstate, very active interstate. And people would come off of exit ramps and literally going 40 or 50 miles an hour here because there wasn't really pedestrian calming. There wasn't anything to kind of really welcome or enhance a connection to the monument itself. So this shows some kind of scale comparisons. This is the original arch grounds. And Saarinen, looking at the successful competition, very dynamic form. And there you can see the space that's really created, the view from the Illinois side looking across towards the Missouri piece of the project, and all these connections that happen between. There's bridges here. There was an early push to really make a connection to the East St. Louis part of the project, but that's still something that would hopefully be resolved It wasn't something we were able to include as part of this competition. This shows you a model that kind of lifts the roof off of what we did. That original construction project showed the roof of the existing museum here, and our work was really involved working closely with Cooper Robertson and Michael Van Valkenburg's team to weave the landscape and the architecture together. Our work was involved in this addition space. So really that kind of sets up the threshold that Jamie was starting to describe, where you create a redirected view and connection back to the city. This is a time-lapse set of images that show the existing lawn, which was a historic lawn, and removing that in order to tuck this set of spaces and the new addition to the existing museum down underneath the ground. One of the challenges here, obviously, is like being underground is how do you give some clear orientation and a welcoming presence to go underground before you go up in the arch, and a real connection to the sky and the city context. So many of these moves here sought to amplify that. Specifically, there's a series of bent glass panels here that was all designed for a very stringent blast criteria, a very lightweight tensile structure that we worked with Eckersley O'Callahan to develop, pulled down and really amplifies in many ways the environment in the sense that, like, when you approach here, you can see the sky kind of embedded in the ground itself. And you also see reflections, depending on the view and where the sun is and the time of day, of the courthouse behind you. So it really kind of seeks to become a viewing device that amplifies those connections to the courthouse, the city, and the arch ground. So this is an aerial view of what I was trying to describe before. That previous view was standing here looking across towards the river. This gives you an idea of the lanes of traffic and the highway that's down underneath. So it was a very extensive development and set of planning moves that was done by the Van Valkenburg team to create a park that extended right across the highway. It always gave you a sense of being in a landscape and not being aware of what was going on in terms of infrastructure and connectivity for vehicular traffic. One of the critical things with this project was that you see it as a catalyst for the city. So getting people out of their cars, many people would come to the city and go up in the arch and then leave and never visit the city. So this was an effort to really also reinvigorate foot traffic along all these businesses and really get all the participants within this immediate proximity to benefit from the arch redevelopment. Jamie was talking a lot about the Alanod material and kind of sense of brightness that you get within the plane. This is a model that was developed in our studio of a ceiling that I'll show you in a subsequent photo of that space down underneath the ground that gives you a sense of brightness and connection to something above. We weren't able to go through that historic landscape with skylights. So this was a tunable LED system that works with the daylight cycles outside to amplify your connection to that kind of small aperture that we have in the project, but really give you a welcoming and arrival space and transition as you descend over 24 feet from your arrival point down into the new connection. This is the threshold to the existing museum. So everything you see beyond this opening, the rectangular opening here, was the existing 100,000 square foot museum space. So you can see that in between this, what we've done is that we've worked very closely with the structural engineering team and others to develop a lighting system that works with the structure. There's a series of post-tension beams that span over this entire width. And in between that, there's these optical aluminum panels that Jane was describing. We developed a custom ceiling system here where there's a series of lights that shine up onto that optical aluminum, and that amplified brightness comes down onto the walking surfaces, both here at this mezzanine level, at the lowest level, and at the entry level. So you have a real connection to something above you, kind of a perception that there's space above, and also directly back. So you can kind of make out the courthouse. We've been in this museum, Jamie and I together, where you actually see light, Western light, a beam of sunshine, it's a line of sight, comes straight down all the way through, almost to the existing threshold into the existing museum. So there's a really direct connection to the outdoors here. Even though we were kind of working with a reduced aperture, by creating geometries that work within that, we were able to connect a little bit better to this kind of moment outside. This is a park that was developed by Michael van Valkenburg's team with a fountain that kids play in. I touched briefly on the notion of a memorial that's not an object, that's a space. And one of the things that was really critical here, it wasn't our first design, or our second design actually, for a new entry, was the idea of universal access. So there's no entry doors here on center directly in axis underneath the arch. The entries are all on the edges over here. So by extending the length, we were able to make sure that everybody travels the same path, but also comes on axis and then moves off axis and then moves on axis and moves off axis. So there's this constant shifting, almost as if the circulation paths were like with the water going down the river, and they're avoiding rocks or going around rocks or impediments in between. So there's kind of a flow that results. And I was trying to describe some of the optics that happen within the glass itself. You get some reflections on that back to the courthouse spaces. And it sets up kind of overall assemblage that is very deferential, I think, to the monument, without seeking to really establish a threshold, a new kind of uplifting, welcoming experience into the arch itself. So this is obviously a point of a lot of civic pride for people in this part of Missouri. This is their annual festival, 4th of July. They have a huge crowd of people on top of the new edition, the existing edition. This is the type of thing that I think we talked a lot with the structural engineers. It makes everybody nervous, the loading that kind of comes out of this, but it really creates a civic space and a place for people to be and connect with. So he's into a very different environment in terms of like the hot and humid Midwest. And
here we are.
Into Israel.
Here we are in Israel, very actually a very interesting environment, Israel and Jerusalem in particular. Just for those of you just interested in lighting phenomenon, if you looked at a section, geological section of, like, say, from the Mediterranean up to Jerusalem, which is sort of like due east, and then from Jerusalem dropping down into the valley, the Dead Sea Valley, you see something which is quite unusual. You have on one side of this high point, which is the city of Jerusalem, you have a Mediterranean climate. You have very high moisture and lushness of sort of plant life and sort of the particulate matter in the air that you get from that. And then the opposite of that is when the wind blows from east to west, when you get weather coming off of the desert, which goes for 1,000 miles east of this location, where you get an enormous amount of dust storms and just a much more sort of solid, not moisture in the air, but just the opposite, sort of particulate matter in the air. So light here is really quite remarkable and changeable from day to day or season to season. And so we're very, very interested in trying to work with that. And this project is it's essentially the National Museum of Israel, built in the early 60s by an emigre architect from Germany. And you can sort of see the key cluster there. It's sort of the middle. There are small cubic volumes that are sort of linked together. And you go into these buildings and you can see the windows. We're looking from the north, so you're seeing wider windows at the north and very thin, narrow gun slots around the east, west, and south. So the buildings were virtually plenty of light, certainly, but very dark from the point of view of orientation. You never really knew quite where you were relative to the surrounding landscape. So we were asked to become involved in the project first in a planning phase, and then ultimately in terms of designing about 100,000 square feet of new space. And then there were also similar amount of area in terms of renovation of the galleries. And it involved taking down quite a few buildings that were here. I mean, you'll see if we click the slide. But this is a museum that has a very extensive collection. It's sort of like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the sense that it has ethnographic, archaeological, contemporary, Middle Eastern, it has a full breadth of painting, sculpture, content. So quite extensive. And what you see in the foreground, that little, what looks like a white Hershey kiss, is actually the Shrine of the Book. So this is actually the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls reside, very beautiful building done by Frederick Kiesler. And then the garden you have there, those curving stone walls, is all done by Izumo Noguchi. So quite an interesting sort of outdoor park, outdoor sculpture park by Noguchi, Dead Sea Scrolls, and then this original set of buildings. And what we did is we took out, as happens in a lot of, obviously almost all projects, over time, the clarity of the original scheme gets lost by added pieces. So we removed a lot of those added pieces and then added what you see here, a series of 5 new buildings. And a key thing was dealing with entry, where the cursor was there, you enter the campus there, and you then have to go up about 30 feet vertically, 30 to 45 feet vertically, and then go down into the entry of the museum. This is how it was originally structured. So what we needed to do was build a new entry pavilion, which is where the cursor is now, which is a little bit further up in the core of the building. And then you'll see in the next image some of the work necessary to create sort of universal access again, or sort of accessibility access, which is basically carving right up through the center of the campus under that existing walkway, basically sort of a level passage way, which you'll see these are the sort of the original buildings. And then this is what's in that passageway below ground. It's basically a long pedestrian walkway. It's about 100 yards long. It brings in light through, on the right-hand side, through a skylight overhead that goes from 18 feet below ground up to 50 feet below ground. And we're trying to manage the daylight availability so it feels consistent on your way up. You're not going into a darker and darker environment. You're going into a somewhat uniformly lit environment. And then there are light wells that are planted. So you have a sense of landscape coming down into these light wells. So you don't really feel like you've ever left the garden or the landscape above. And a few strategic skylights on the left-hand side you see here. What's interesting though, perhaps, is that the wall on the left-hand side here, this is just to speak a little bit about the materiality, is actually, these are ceramic extrusion planks. They're about 10 feet tall, and they have sort of like a gunmetal glaze on them. So if you looked at them perpendicularly, they would look fairly black and not so responsive. But as soon as you look at them obliquely, they have quite a sheen to them. And the floor is actually totally black here too. So it's a black floor and a black wall opposed by a white ceiling and a daylit wall, translucent glass wall. So you're just working with two bright surfaces and then 2 black surfaces. And how do these two sort of play off of each other? So it's very interesting how the color sort of is carried down through the different materials, and you sort of really feel this piece at the top, which is Olafur Eliasson. But this is the main tunnel, the main experience coming in. The original buildings, this is a close-up of one of the original buildings. That's the little gun slot at the top. Obviously, they're dealing with intense sunlight by restricting the aperture size and providing a slightly larger aperture to the north. But we wanted to keep the same geometry for the new buildings. These all have a central column that supports the roof overhead. And if you jump to what we wanted to try and do, we wanted to do all the new buildings in glass, actually just clear glass, laminated, no performance coatings at all. And you're looking at the design of the individual louvers that were designed specifically to address, we're on a hilltop, so we have sunrise and sunset coming in directly horizontally to these elevations. So That upper piece is your east-west louver that you can see in the middle there. And then the sort of little radiance studies of what happens. And if you look carefully at the radiance study, you'll see that the cove shape on the louver, the intensity of light sort of collects on that cove. And then the cove brightness actually illuminates the louver surface above it. So what you're doing here is you're keeping out the harmful solar radiation of this part of the world by using the ceramic tile, but then you're taking advantage of that light to wash the inside inclined surface of the tile above it. So you have something here that's both a shading device and a lighting device simultaneously. And I'll show this to you. So the north-south is a very different shape, obviously, because of the inclination of the sun. Early study models. So we have just glass walls behind these shading systems. So none of the buildings receive any direct light. So you can scale back the mechanical systems of the building and obviously save a lot of money and have a lot more glazed area in this type of undertaking. And then this is sort of what happens. I mean, this is just a test in our office where we typically build mock-ups of all of our projects full scale and then study them. And this is sort of what you get. There's color coming, in this case, a piece of colored glass, but it could be color bounced off a tree or whatever. But inside the building, you see the exterior on the far right-hand side, all that intensity of light is blocked, but the color is basically bounced and then projected onto that inside surface of the ceramic. So there's a way of having, again, sort of a cinematic connection to the exterior, but there's no view. You just get shadow play and color play from the interior. So if you jump to the next image here, just the way these things are made, these are extrusions, ceramic extrusions. So we design the piece in our office and then mock it up with those cardboard models you saw earlier. Again, east-west is top. Full-scale mock-up built on site about a year before the construction began to test it for cleaning and all of that. And really does not need any cleaning. It's sort of self-cleaning. And then the building. So if you just look at this image, we're looking from the north to the south here. So in the north and south, we've used a very open louver because the inclination or the angle of the sun is so much higher. You can space them more apart from each other. So we have visibility into these buildings now. The original buildings, as you see in the distance, were solid concrete blocks. So you had no idea if the building was open, there were people there or anything. So this whole idea is it allows the building to have more animation and presence for the public on this axis, this north-south axis. And then it has that 100% shading east-west on the opposing angles. So this is both view in and view out. So we go forward here a little bit. This is the idea. The walkways are shaded by the screening systems. And there you have one of the buildings, the conventional building, just floor to ceiling, clear glass, laminated, no tinting, no coatings at all. And you're able to reduce the mechanical systems by about 30% because there's no load, solar radiation. So if you move ahead here, and then this is what you have. This is like at the time of the buildings being built. It's much more active now, but you sort of see a shadow on the exterior of the building is projected on the left-hand side into the space itself. So you get this movement and wind and people walking, but you're not actually seeing it directly. And then this is the idea that you can look through north-south, so you can see out through these, but they're providing shading for those spaces. And then we'll go one more here, a couple more of this project. And throughout the whole landscape, there are shaded walkways by these very simple planted areas and sort of these little pergolas overhead that provide shade. And then this is looking through that tunnel. This is the entry to that tunnel I showed you at the beginning. So you have people walking above you, and then you enter that tunnel, turn to your left, and then you move up through that long walkway. And then a very interesting project, and one that we, here you are, you're now standing about 35 feet below ground. And then here it is at night. I think we have one last, show you the quality of the landscape that's shared, and then this final project. This is the Frost Amphitheater at Stanford. It was an amphitheater built in the 1930s. And I'm just going to run this little video for you as a conclusion that Joe and I, what you're looking at here is sort of the fog coming over the mountains, and it sort of clings to the treetops. So we just took that very organic form of that sort of fog or mist. And then on the bottom here, sort of a section through the canopy structure. It's nested relatively low in this space. How it works in terms of either raising or lowering the temperature of the building. And the very famous venue for, all Joan Baez, Jefferson Airplane, you name it, they all played here at one time. So it holds about 8,000 people, and we were asked to provide shading and environmental control for up to about 3,000 people. And keep going to the video part of it. So it's basically a deployable fabric roof that could be deployed, say, on a warm day. You deploy it in the morning, keep the ground cool, and then you retract it at night, and then have a cooler environment. Reverse the fabric tracked, covered at night. But the thing to note here is that it's, that didn't seem like it played through completely. It sort of jumped to the end. Okay. We're sort of at our time limit here, I guess.
I was keeping the sound though.
So the whole idea of nesting this lower in the space, this all comes back to all this idea of working with shadow and imagery, and how you make it sort of a space that people feel very comfortable in and very sort of animated by. But as the sun sets, because this is residing low in this space, you actually get the shadow of the trees sort of falling on that canopy overhead. So you're in this space. The canopy of the trees is around you, and the canopy of the trees is above you. So it's just a way of trying to connect you more directly to the nature around you. So we don't seem to be able to run this video for you, but that's sort of our last slide. And I just hope we touched on some of the points, which I'm sure you may have some questions about. But just this whole idea of interaction and light. And materials, how we sort of find different materials that are appropriate for the particular problem we're addressing or the opportunity. And then this whole awareness of the environment, how to, this whole thing that we're always trying to restate or refine or reframe qualities of nature that exist around us, and bring that into everyone's experience, collective experience. And this whole idea of creating works which are distinctly related to their particular environment. I mean, this would not really be a logical solution anywhere else, but it happens to fit this particular environment perfectly. So, so Joe and I would be happy to answer questions that any of you might have. And hopefully you found the work of interest and intriguing.
Yeah, if people want to raise their hand or add a question to the chat, we can spend a little time in discussion with Jamie and Joe. I was kind of taken aback with all the, very light connections that you guys end up using at the MTA project, and then what you're planning for at Stanford, those light metal connections. Do you guys just have kind of an intuitive sense as to what you can pull off, or do you have to like run to your structural engineer to really, you know, say, hey, can we do this?
I would say we're pretty, I think as a office, you know, sort of Joe and others in the office, we're all, I think, very much engineering aware of structural engineering, and obviously rely on some people who we have very high respect for, particularly our primary engineer, Schleich Bergermann and Partners from Germany, for lightweight structures, cable tension structures. But we have a sense of what we want to try to accomplish. And as I sort of said, each project, all of a sudden, you know, over time, none of them happened right away, but over time, things sort of seem to fall into place. I mean, just the context, or you having to changing, you know, as a lot of times the buildings are changing around us during the process of design due to other circumstances. And we need to be a little bit fleet of foot to keep the idea alive under these different circumstances. Yeah, I think we have a strong materials understanding. Our office is really probably a little bit more like a workshop. I mean, it's full of material samples and mock-ups of different vintages and different scales. And we often build full-scale mock-ups of things in our office just to look at over a period of time. Like you might build something and you have it there for 6 months, and you just, you know, pay attention to what it's doing. And then we use that information when it comes down to actually trying to document the final project. And Joe, you have some things to add to that.
That's really good description. We explore a lot of different things on a variety of projects, but immerse ourselves really in each project for the conditions that Jamie was articulating. You know, what to solve for light and the opportunities. And a lot of things don't get built. So we continue to explore, and there's many iterations within the studio that we try to go back and revisit and maybe kind of build upon and go a little bit greater depth potentially with material fabricators, or just a finish, like a straight surface finish on a particular material sometimes, or a different geometry that can do a lot. So.
But we're always looking for new things too.
Yeah.
We're a small studio. This might be of interest to people. We're a fairly small studio. I think now we're maybe 12 people. We're generally between 12 and 16 or something. What we do well is we understand the materials. We have a pretty good understanding of obviously the structural issues, and then conceptually, we obviously try to work with light in a way that's sort of unique to our practice, and this whole idea of connecting back to nature. But we actually have, like Schleich Bergermann Partners, we have other firms that we work with consistently over a long period of time. We've worked with Schleich Bergermann for 35 years. Mm-hmm. So we have a core group of people there, or with Tri-Pyramid Structures, who do a lot of the stainless steel cable systems with us, or Matthias Schuller from Transsolar on mechanical or engineering ideas conceptually. So we have a group of people that we've always team up with on projects. And I think having that group of collaborators over time has been very helpful, advancing their work and advancing our work simultaneously.
I think that Hugh Carroll had a question about the MTA project in New York. Hugh, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if I assume that it's glass that, you know, is keeping the elements out and allowing the sunlight in. And in my experience, usually those, you know, the orientation would be to the north to reduce glare and solar heat gain. I'm just curious, not having been in New York City for far too long, what's the orientation of that glass slope? Is it facing north or?
It's actually funny. It's actually facing more southeasterly. And that had to do with the presence of larger buildings to the north.
Okay.
So had you sloped it to the north, you would have seen those buildings. And sort of the way it's oriented now, you don't really see buildings out of it. I mean, you do if you're very oblique, you can see them, but if you're under, you don't see them.
Very cool.
And it had obviously had a performance coating on it, and I guess the point I was trying to make is that, and it may not be the best example of this, but I think you can make your apertures smaller and smaller than we typically do, should you be able to frame that aperture with materials like this alanod, like that metal, these optical materials, which can basically push the light over a larger surface and have that light still retain, you know, enough illumination or enough presence that it can illuminate a much larger space. I think we're too often just dealing with a window and a flat wall, and the window generating too much light and too much contrast. So some way of reducing aperture size and maximizing distribution of the light over more surface area to diminish glare and diminish that contrast.
That's great. I was curious about, you know, how long it took you yourself, Jamie, to kind of arrive at what you were really doing, because it looked like you were very experimental in the early 70s.
Yeah, we haven't arrived yet, I don't think. So, no, I think that my own trajectory, yeah, I think maybe for students it's probably interesting. It's just that actually before I went to RISD, I was doing like botanical illustration and stuff like that. But I don't know what it was. Just light always has been something that's captivated me, and I just, you know, I got very deeply involved in glass as a material. And, you know, right when I left Corning, like in the late 70s, you know, I got involved with the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank building, the glazing on that, because Foster was interested in using a glass that I'd been part of a team developing at Corning, a photosensitive glass. So I got deeply involved in that, managing part of that project and the mock-up for that. And I sort of realized that there was a way for me to come back into architecture, but sort of bring my understanding of light and the capacity of glass, you know, in a broader sense, rather than just depending on what, you know, the basic glass manufacturers produce, what glass actually could do. And that's the fascination with glass in particular, is that it's, from my perspective, it's really, you know, it's less a material than it is a state of matter. I mean, glass can take on any form, you know, performance, whatever you want it to be, it can be. And it's, you know, there's millions and millions and millions of compositions of glass that do everything from optical waveguides to computer chip circuitry, whatever it is. Now, glass has a much broader wealth of capacity than most any other material. And I think that sort of unlimited capacity that it has, in a way, is always inspirational, that there's always something more it can do. And then in our studio, you know, we just keep exploring things. And as Joe said, a lot of things don't get built. A lot of things just sit around for years. And then you sort of have an opportunity where you might revive an idea and apply it. But I'd say we're very opportunistic as a studio. You know, the opportunity might not seem like it has a lot to offer. And then we really try to figure out what can we really do with this to turn it into something exceptional. So it's always questioning those things in your studio.
Yeah. You guys, do you have like a small machine shop where you're at?
Well, we have a shop. We have a little shop, but machine shop, no. We sort of rely on other people in terms of actually machining parts necessarily. But we have a pretty extensive library, class library.
Yeah. We try to visit fabricators, you know, their shops, and be inspired too by how they make things, because you may discover things within that process that wasn't readily available on how they were marketing their material. So there's connections potentially to like an earlier form of fabrication or something that got outdated that could be used in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like those Chicago light masks, that's a pretty good case in point. That's a company that does filtration systems and they hadn't really done architectural projects per se. And we first used them on World Trade Center Tower 7, wrapping the whole Con Edison substation at the base of that 6-story base of that Tower 7. And then working with them on those light towers. And the funny thing, it's sort of reciprocal, because in some of the work we did with their machinery, we asked them to do something they hadn't really done before, which was to sort of shape the ribbing system that gets wrapped with these stainless steel wires. And one of the shapes that we came up with, they then did a fluid dynamic analysis of the shape, and it turned out it actually provided better filtration than their existing system. So they began using some of the things we contributed to the process, even though we were looking at it from an aesthetic point of view, but it just used their machine in a different way than they'd done before in the last 90 years. So anyway, yeah, I think that Joe's point, we learn a lot from the people we work with, and then we try to use it in a way that may be different than how they imagined.
I know that you've done a lot of residential work early on. Do you guys still do some residential, or how's the new stuff different?
Well, we don't necessarily do, we do parts of residential projects, I guess you might say, right? We have done quite a few elements within residential projects become sort of a featured piece of that. And what we do like about that is they offer an opportunity to explore an idea at a certain scale that's very manageable and something we would build ourselves typically. But what you learn from those things is then can be translated into a much larger scale project eventually, right? So we do enjoy doing, residential things for that reason. I mean, you can do something innovational at that scale and then study it and learn from it. One of the most important projects of that sort would have been a window we did with Vince James on a house in Minneapolis. And it has to do with an issue of windows that don't have a view, which a lot of windows have that problem. They don't have a view. And it was a field of lenses. If you look at this up on our webpage, it's called the Dayton Window. And it's basically a series of lenses and a series of mirrors outside that are like periscopics, like a periscopic mirror with a lens positioned in front of it and a sheet of diffused glass. And there's 80 of these lenses in this window. It's like a view camera. When you look down into a focal plane of a view camera, the lens actually, focal length is a certain distance. And what you get is you get an image of trees in the distance. Then you get the projection of shadows of that tree on the window itself. And then you get sort of pinhole camera images or from the tree as the sun passes through the tree. So you're taking information that exists in the world outside of the space you occupy. You're sort of reassembling it and presenting it. So you actually create a new sense of reality. It's really sort of an augmented reality, but you're just using what's there and then collaging it together. And it changes all times of the day or all times, even that particular window, in the wintertime when there's no leaves on the tree, you can see the moon and you see like 80 images of the moon in the window. Wow. So it's just a sort of special, small thing. It's not so small, but it sort of makes this one transition place in the house quite exceptional, right? So that's why we like to do things like that, sort of experiment with things that we learn from and hopefully our clients enjoy.
That sounds like it'd be something to see. Do the clients open up their home to come view it?
Okay. We have some documentation. We unfortunately never really documented it well, but I think we will try and do some videos of it. It was done quite a long time ago.
Yeah. what projects do you guys currently have or are doing or have done in California? It seems like most of your work is Midwest or East Coast.
Yeah, originally when we started, back, this is like 80s, early 90s, actually all of our work was in Europe. A lot of our work was in Germany, and in England we did a bunch of things working with Foster. But yeah, today, New York, recently we've had quite a bit of work in New York. Joe may speak to a couple of projects that we're doing.
Yeah, we finished a flagship store for Nordstrom in Midtown Manhattan last year, right before the pandemic. But that was a quite extensive project. That was a 5-year project. We have a project in the Midwest we're doing in just north of Detroit area. But yeah, circling back to the question, we're working on a project in San Diego that's interfaces closely with Gensler, working closely with their team. And I see Matthews on from HLB, working closely with the lighting, daylighting group to develop a iconic or a statement facade. That's kind of actively on the boards. And Jamie, you had done a number of projects that interfaced with some infrastructure, airports in San Francisco.
Right. We worked quite a while ago on the international terminal in San Francisco, the roof with Skidmore, with shading systems underneath the main skylights. We did some work also for the federal courthouse in San Francisco. And a few here and there. And Stanford, we just finished.
Stanford Hospital. Yeah,
hospital for the new Vignoli Hospital. We did a piece that it's actually like trying to capture the quality of light on the surface of the ocean. It's funny, in a hospital, they want something that's very sort of calming and serene to look at. They thought they'd have water, but you're not allowed to have water in a hospital in California because it might potentially have bacteria in it or something. So we sort of did this, what I think is very, very beautiful, 40-foot diameter, also using aluminum and cast glass. Sort of looks like a wave pattern, but it changes obviously with a big skylight overhead with different sun angles on it. So yeah, we sort of have a few things going on in California.
It'd be nice to see more work like the museum in Israel.
Yeah, we're doing a little museum right now in Denmark. So it's a small museum on an island. Actually, it's off the coast of Sweden. But it's it's like an art museum that exists. And then we're actually doing a museum of light, sort of built into this. And then that's also part of a cultural history museum that we're doing. So it has like 3 components to it, but that's just in the sort of the first stages, sort of planning stages. So yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anybody else who would like to ask any questions here? Looks like
we have a fairly large audience, but a quiet one today, which is
yes,
fine. I'm just happy that we have a lot of people here. So thanks for being here, and thanks to all of you.
Yeah,
I'll let you finish it.
Right.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll wrap it up here. I know it's getting later for you guys, almost 7:30.
Exactly.
So I wanted to thank both of you for spending the time with us today.